Good evening. Uh, a bit about the title of the panel that we have given. It's a quaint, puzzling kind of title. It's called The Tradition of the New and the Newness of Tradition. As Eliot, whom I will be just referring for more than once, said that bad poets imitate, good poets steal. So I have stolen this title actually from a very famous book called The Tradition of the New by Harold Rosenberg. And what he was taking on is Ezra Pound's famous dictum, "Make it new," as a rallying cry for the little magazine movements in America, as a rallying cry for modernism. And the second part of the title, The Tradition of the New, suggests that the whole thing about newness itself has become a tradition. The book marks, I think, can be beginning of postmodernism debates in the West, where you see modernism as established point rather than struggling to make its place felt in the American or the European canons. So the question is relation between modernism and postmodernism, really. The another point that is being suggested in the title is something called newness of tradition, by which I want to convey that whenever people declare that we are making something new, we are actually looking at the tradition in a fresh light. We are not rejecting tradition, but we are reinventing tradition for ourselves. So postmodernist movements also sought to reinvent the traditions for themselves after 1945 onwards. So anybody who wants to be a poet after the age of 25, as Eliot famously said, you need to have something called historic sense, the sense of the tradition and the sense of new. So one of the place from where serious poetry can emerge is the conflicting or dynamic relation between the tradition and modernity. On our panel, we have got distinguished poets of various backgrounds and locations. We have poets writing from English, very young poets like Mihir Chitre. We have senior writers and translators with us, and we have visual artists. So all of us, we are struggling with the question of how to reinvent the tradition and how to avoid the new being a tradition in its own right. So one of the points that I started looking up was an article written by Vinda Karandikar called Parampara Ani Navta, where he lays out a framework for tradition and modernity debate, saying that modernity is what you experience while tradition is being made. परंपरा बनत असते तेव्हा ज्याची प्रचिती येते त्याला नवता म्हणतात. And tradition is when you internalize modernity. When modernity has become part of your consciousness, that is where tradition emerges. So he sets up a dynamic relation between parampara and navata, not limiting itself either to East or the West debate, because very often when we say modernism, we say it has come from the West. Karandikar seems to suggest that it's part of every culture. There is a dynamism towards newness and there is a dynamism towards tradition. So he's giving a framework which is not a kind of Western influence framework that we are used to when we look at things like avant-garde, modernism, and so on. The other model of looking at tradition and modernity would be a very famous book by Harold Bloom called Anxiety of Influence, where every new generation of writers seem to define themselves against the earlier generation. And as I'm laying down this debate, I'm talking from a point of view of a practicing writer and as I have to confront these debates. So basically the panel will be these distinguished authors, translators will be talking from their experience, how they handled or engaged with the question of tradition and modernity in their own way, and how they resolved it or did not resolve it. And the context, of course, is 2017. We are looking at writings from future. We are looking at future from here onwards. What kind of questions of tradition and modernity will arise? if you are to believe Karandikar, then it arises in all the periods, in all the cultures across the world. So I will request all the panelists to talk about it in a nutshell, in a brief, in 5 minutes, given the time constraints. And finally, after this panel gets over, we'll take questions, and then we'll go over to poetry reading, which will be a kind of, it will give you a sense of how this crisis was handled by various poets themselves. So that is how we have structured the panel. So I would like to start with Sanjeev on my right, and we will just go. So Sanjeev, please share your views.
Yeah, well, I just continue and take a thread from you, and again quote from Eliot. A very interesting quote it is. The most individual parts of the poet's work may be those in which the dead poets, the ancestors, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. So that's how when he talked about traditions and individual, where he further talked about selflessness of the poet, where the poet loses his identity, himself as such, and variety of things he talks. I think that's very, always I find this particular essay, one is Eliot, on the other side, Calvino. Why do we have classics? So these two major works basically inform us that how, why and how traditions are important. And most of the times, outside and almost every platform, political, social, and literary, people talk about the greatness of traditions, but nobody talks about the absence of traditions in an artistic way, in a poetic way, that need to be present in our every work of art or even a political work. Here, one more thing I would like to, historical timelessness. That's one interesting phenomenon, or a kind of a concept which Eliot talked about. Eliot was writing this when, in the times of when modernity was at the peak, rather, and the postmodern was yet to born. What is more important? Of course, T.S. Eliot did not know what's going to happen in postmodern, how the entire tradition, history, etc. are going to take a back seat, and rather the postmodern will come forward telling us that we are all burdened with the history. Not just, awareness of history is gone, yet, the burden of history looms. Karl Marx also says in an interesting way that the burden of the past, burden of the history looms in such a big way over us. Now here, what helps us is Frederick Jameson. So I'm just taking it from Eliot to Jameson, just 3-4 minutes. I can't give too many examples. But Jameson here talks again, taking clue from Marx, about, he says that historize everything. He says that if at all you want to do revolution in art, if you want to do revolution in architecture, if you want to do revolution in poetry, if you want to do revolution in cinema, if you want to do revolution on the street, if you want to change the political order, what needs to be done? He says, historize. And he says that why it is needed. Especially he's writing in the 90s, in the second half of 90s, when postmodern is completed one circle. From end of art, 1964, 65, of Andy Warhol onwards, we have got variety of, in literature and art, both sides, variety of people talking about it. And he says it's needed because what has happened? Suddenly, he says, whatever happened in modernism, which basically questioned, which basically rebelled, which challenged everything in every possible way, boldly, sex to anger, violence to whatever. You think of anything, and modernism made a big hue and cry about it. Modernism made a huge image out of it. Modernism made the middle class, made the establishment upset about it. But what he says, what happened subsequently, and there he talks with politics, how the politics comes into picture, and how the political order comes into picture, the way we just now, in the earlier session, Kumar Ketkar referred Manmohanji and said, politics is literature and literature is politics. One mirrors another one, or one gives birth to another one, or one talks about another one. So what he says, why historize? And Frederick Jameson, he says, what happened in the entire modern activity, all this rebel, all this unrest, the subsequent tide of late capitalism swallowed so beautifully, like a chewing gum, he said. And he converted the entire rebel, he converted the entire revolution, the new late capitalism, he says, it converted entire rebel of literature and art into another canon. From Picasso to Camus to whatever writer you take, or whatever poet you take, whatever artist you take, Andy Warhol, whatever. He says that all became parts of our textbook on one side. So the entire revolution was textbookized. And on the other side, most of them started appearing on the billboards. Picasso has been used in such a variety of ways to sell a variety of products. From underwears to contraceptives, and from fruits to something like medicine, whatever. Quotes from, should I just stop?
One.
Yeah, okay. So I'll stop here because this is I'll go into, as I said, this is a huge kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I wanted to basically emphasize Eliot to Jameson, because yes, Eliot said history is important and timelessness of history, but we need to go, I mean, that statement made in modern times, modernism needs to be further fortified, augmented, and we should be read with Frederick Jameson also.
Yeah, thanks. That's something very interesting you said about the development of late capitalism, where modernism was made into kitsch. It was turned into a kind of consumer commodity item, where modernism no longer had its revolutionary thrust that it was supposed to have. Late capitalism showed itself up only after the 90s in Marathi as well as in Indian, where you see globalization, liberalization, and privatization coming in a big way after the collapse of Soviet Union in the 90s. And this was the period when people like Hemant and I were struggling to find our own voice against the context. And we were also looking at our own precursors, Chitre, Kolatkar, we looked Dasal, Dhake, among others. And we were in awe of them on the one hand. On the other hand, we thought that this also has become a tradition. And it is part of the tradition. It's no longer the new, but the tradition of the new that seems to have happening. So we thought to come out of it, discover our own voice and our own newness in some way. So Hemant is witness and a fellow practitioner and person who has struggled like Sanjeev and I with discovering what is new in after 1990s. So if you can tell something about your own personal journey and your love and hate relation with the 60s.
I am not much learned person. I have not read many poems of Eliot himself, but I am friend of time. I read time, and actually all the poets are very close friends of time. So I look at time. When I started writing, I read Marathi poetry of, say, around 800 years. You will think that I have read so many poets or whatever, but it's not like that. I mean, I just read Tukaram, Daneshwar, Eknath, Chokoba, and all the other saint poets, and then directly I had to come to the 20th century, when there was a right turn given by Keshav Sud. And then later on, Mardekar, and then these little magazine movement poets, Arun Kolatkar, Dilip Chitre, Dasal, Vasant Dattatreya Gurjar, and all that. What I think actually, that when you want to create something new as a practicing poet or author, you have to read tradition, learn tradition, read all this, but you have to unlearn also. The process of unlearning takes a lot of time, because the learning also takes a lot of time. So I actually spent around 10 to 12 years just scratching the back of poetry. I don't know if there is a back of poetry, but I was on the surface. I could not find my voice. And later on, actually time helped me. In 1990s, the process of globalization started. I come from a very small village near Mumbai. The process of globalization actually was giving a lot of trouble to me inside. I was in advertising, I am in advertising. So as an advertising salesperson, I used to visit all these industries, the clients and all. There I found that everything is changing now. Email and whatever. I have written a lot of things about this. So actually I found newness from the time, from the globalization. I will not go deep into the other aspects. What I'll do is, there is a 6-line poem where there is one line which will maybe prove that how I look at new. The poem is Butterfly. Ambling by in the garden of the apartment complex, I casually remarked to a friend, "Don't see those small, deep yellow butterflies these days." He casually said, "That brand has been discontinued." That brand has been discontinued. So this is the way I look at the thing. And maybe these people will elaborate more, because they have a literary background and professors, and they read a lot of things. I read people, I read time. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting thing that probably he did not emphasize is the relation with the 1960s and the crisis that globalization created for us. One of the points from where we criticized the 60s was the generation of writers like Nemade and others, was that the anti-establishment posturing that came through their writings was not actually to be seen in their life. Means you would go on to win all sorts of prizes and say that writers should not make a career out of writing. Means that's what they would say. You live a bohemian life, don't make a career out of writing, and you don't spare any awards or you don't spare any place of respect. So you are eager to become part of establishment, and it's not about single writer, it's about many of them. So we found that though poetry was amazing, the posturing that came through sounded a bit fake in the 90s when we look back retrospectively. It was a revolution, but then was it? That's the question that we ask. So this relation is one of the important aspects of our writing. Somehow this kind of crisis of relation with past is not seen pronounced in Indian writing in English, especially poetry. It's not pronounced, probably owing to the confusion that what is the place of English in India, is still people are debating it, as we have been seeing from past 2 days. So we as writers, I have bilingual writers, are pretty sorted out and clear that in English that we use is Indian English and it's an Indian language. However, the charges of authenticity and nationality to be proved over and over again, the debate sounds stale to our ears today in 2017. However, the relation between the writers of modernist generation like Nizam Ezekiel or Jayant Mahapatra and again Kolatkar and Chitre and the contemporary writing is, I think, in some way gray. Means we are not very clear how they stand on this. On one hand, you relate to its modernity. On the other hand, I don't see any pronounced effort to transcend the idiom which was invented in the 60s with A.K. Ramanujan or the giants of Indian poetry in English. That crisis doesn't seem to reflect in today's Indian English poetry, partly because English is probably more global presence compared to Marathi, where things are in front. Our tradition is pretty clear, means. However, when it comes to Indian writing in English, we are not sure what is our tradition. Is it a mix of both? It's neither or what? So these are the issues I think even Mihir and would have faced. So what do you have to say about this? How do you tackle these issues?
Check. Yes, you're right. Tradition, in that sense, you are always confused as a writer writing in English. You're always confused what exactly your tradition is in India to begin with. Because if we try to trace the tradition of the English language and English poetry, then that's a much wider spectrum altogether. And there is not much. Of course, the names you mentioned have been great writers, and they've created their own idiom and they've created their own tradition at some level. But at the end of the day, I don't know, first of all, as an individual, if in the face of modernism that we stand, how much of importance do we actually want to allot to traditions, or do I try and write to be part of a tradition eventually? I think once you start writing with that intent, I think somewhere you are, as an individual, somewhere you are probably doing injustice to your experience. If I will never write anything, so far I have never written anything thinking that this could be part of a new tradition or this is a deliberate attempt to create new idiom. However, if that happens automatically, it's brilliant, and that's probably the biggest takeaway you can get. So I think modernism is a concept that you guys spoke a lot about, which is a different concept from modernity. What is modernity? What is my life right now? Probably modernity for me starts on a Monday morning at Andheri signal in a traffic jam. I mean, that's how your life begins, and those are the things that you encounter every day. And unless you write about those experiences, you're never going to be honest. Now, since the times have changed and the times keep changing in every generation, automatically your product would be fresh. And probably your approach to poetry is obviously a product of a lot of things. It's a product of your sensibility. It's a product of what you've read, what you've not read, what you like, how your eye for the world. That's what makes a poet, right? So I would say that I am not much of a believer of making a deliberate attempt to create tradition. However, if any of my work, let's say 50 years down the line, happens to be part of tradition, I'll be the happiest.
Yeah, that's a very interesting take, that as you are living in an altered life and culture, poetry based on your experiences will automatically be different from your precursors. However, there is still a selection that you have to make from what is available. For example, there is Sarojini Naidu and there is Dilip Chitre, for example, right? Then you make a selection. It's not just that I feel I have an itch on my chin and I write a poem about it. It's not so experiential, because poetry itself is a form of language. and it's not invented by us. It has come down through ages. So the trap, I think, would be to enter into domain of realism or a cliche of a kind, which is very dangerous. You just talk about what I feel in this world. But poetry is much more than that. So what's your I will come to you. So if you can briefly in a minute, if you can.
I know that, poetry is a lot more than that, and whatever I said is with all due respect to all traditions, and obviously you need to be as familiar as possible with different kinds of literature. So nobody is debating that. What I'm trying to say is that there are two ways of approaching this, approaching being a writer itself, like your existence as a writer. One is to plan before that this, I have read this much, I know that I'm aware of these traditions. If I write something about a certain thing that nobody has written about, and using those things just to include them in your content to make it feel fresh is one way of going about it, which I am not a fan of. The second way that I'm talking about, I understand that it's not as experiential as, itch in the chin, but probably even from that itch, you can get an image somewhere which is part of a poem that talks about a much larger thing. And that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, before I come to Shafiji, one of the most important issues in the question of tradition and modernity and newness is the question of translation. Translation, I think, is the heart of the question itself about relation between tradition and modernity. And I personally feel as a translator that whatever is you think is new is actually a translation from some other domain. So whatever we experience as new today has come from somewhere. It has not emerged from nothing into place where you find it. So my own take on tradition and modernity is it's a translation, basically, from domains which are non-traditional, probably. So we are translating non-traditional into traditional when we are inventing something new. So question of translation is something that Shafiji has been preoccupied, especially in the issue of Kashmiri literature and Urdu literature also. Can you say something about your own experiences regarding choices you have made as a translator and why you went around?
That's true. Whenever, for the last 30, 40 years, I have been translating, doing many interlingual and intralingual translations from one language into another. I don't comment on the quality of my translations, but I have been doing this kind of activity. But the basic thing that motivates me to translate a work into another linguistic medium is only when I am myself influenced by that work. It should not be a gratuitous work that it has been assigned by some institute to me against an honorarium, but do it as a commitment to literature to find something new. When I find something new in a literary work, only then I can translate. And I assert that translation is the best way to test the originality, the newness of a literary work, because it happens only when there is something new to say in a different linguistic medium. But unfortunately, this is my personal observation, that in most of the Indian languages, I am talking of the northern Indian languages which I am familiar with, Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi a little, and my Kashmiri and Gojri, etc., that concept of the new is yet to emerge. The concept of new. The concept of new, as all of us know, emerged with the emergence of the novel in the West. When the printing press came, when there was a sudden departure from the mnemonic media to learned media from the memory, the legends, and which were transferred ditto from one generation to another, and then middle class arose and middle class demanded their own representation. And since then, in the West, the concept of the self emerged, and that self, which is objectified in the form of a drama, in the form of a novel, is getting strengthened. It is the process of individuation. which is the secret of the greatness of the Western literature. I am not a crazy advocate of Western literature, but I see, since I have, whatever I am being influenced by the Marxist writings, some existentialist writings, whatever, the French or English, through translations that have made me. That individuation process is yet to take place in Indian languages, because most of the Indian languages are still submerged in the legends, superstitions, myths, and many other forms of things which are thought to be fit for saying. Once they emerge from that oral literature, oral culture, but it does not happen in India. Maybe a little in Marathi, a little in Gujarati, a little in Bengali, but in most of parts of the Indian subcontinent, I'm talking of the whole subcontinent, we are still living in a feudal society, a very rigid feudal society in which all our consciousness is submerged, wallowing in old tradition, cliched, shibboleths and hackneyed metaphors, unless we come out of it. And then also, if we attempt a novel, a short story, a drama, a free verse, all these concepts have come from the West. Let us not shy away from accepting, recognizing this reality. When we accept these genres from the West, we must also accept the standards of writing them. There should be some universal standards of writing a novel, writing a writing a short poem. Let's talk of short poem. It has emerged right from Edgar Allan Poe's concept of short poem, and then to Ezra Pound's that let it be pointed, physical in nature, free from adjectives, free from cliches, only then a free poem. That means, to me, a genuine poem is only that which is committed to the moment, a particularized moment within a particular space. If one is able to create that simulacrum of that experience, only good poem can exist.
Right. Thank you. That is something very interesting what you said about the sensibility of the translator vis-a-vis the sensibility in the source text. Means you said that you are open to the modernist, existentialist, Marxist, avant-garde writings. And when you translate from Indian languages where it's largely feudal, or even where modernity itself doesn't seem to have found its ground, right? So there is a source text which does not actually connect to your modernist sensibility as a translator. One way of resolving is what A.K. Ramanujan did with his translator to bring out the latent modernity in the translation itself when he translates from Sangam literature or from the Vachanakars. So is that the strategy you would also think of when you are translating, that there is already a hidden latent modernity that you as a translator is bringing to forefront?
As I said that before undertaking any translations, I assert my option. For instance, I have successfully translated, which got me many awards also, which was staged, was Vijay Tendulkar's Kanyadhan. When it was translated in Kashmiri and staged there, it got me laurels. But I remained faithful to the original. I don't know Marathi, but through Hindi or some smattering of Marathi words, I got him translated, having the same flavor of that central character. Similarly, when I read Mirza Ghalib, for instance, belonging to the old tradition, which is rhymed poetry, etc. But I saw that he is altogether different when he writes in Persian. He is altogether different what we know him through Urdu literature. Nobody knows him through his Persian poetry, which is his greatest work. And then I translated him from Persian into English, and it is available in the market. I am satisfied with the translation. So my choice matters in this. It should be read as a text, not as an oral thing. All of us cannot afford to be haldars all of us, even if we wish, we respect them, we bow to them, but we cannot afford to be haldar. We cannot afford to be bonds of the past. We have to be accountable to the text. It should get read as a text, not as a song. We must not try to be Javed Akhtar's, Gulzar's. We must not try to be, because that is a different medium. So many arts combine to form a song, but ours is only a text on the page, whether it is electronic, this computer page, Android page, or physical page, paper page. But it should be read as a text, and it has its own rules. Unless we follow those rules of the text, it will fail.
So what you seem to imply is that reading itself is an act of selectivity, and there is an act of uncovering something, like you uncovered Persian Ghalib as against Urdu Ghalib. So in a sense, modernity involves reinvention of tradition. Anju is herself a good translator and a poet, creative writer, and I would like to hear from her, how do you look at the issues of tradition, modernity, and the question of translation also?
Yeah, thank you, Sachin. I think we're coming to the end of this wonderful, wonderful 2 days. We've learned a lot. And as far as today's topic goes, I'll just stay with 2 points, if I may, so that I stay with my time limit, because we can keep on talking of so many issues superficially. The first thing I want to say that I think I read this somewhere, that tradition should be a bond, not a bondage. Tradition should be a bond, but not a bondage. Now, this is quite a loaded statement, because it does imply that we know our tradition. I think I'm quite clear about that. We should know our tradition, whether we learn it slowly after we start writing poetry, whether we are scholars like Sachin and learn it step by step, it doesn't matter. But our famous Indo-English poet, Nissim Ezekiel, once told me that a lady or a girl came to him and said, I don't want to learn about the past in case I am influenced by it. I want my writing to be my voice, my original. And I could see he was quite angry about it, because he was also a professor and a practicing poet. It took me some time to realize this point about bond and bondage. The second thing, and the last, is I want to say is, and I will touch upon translation. Yesterday I heard that about English writers, and as Sachin has said, it has been established now that English is also a regional language. We can't look upon it, you may call it Indo-English now if you like, or whatever we call ourselves, but whether one likes it or not, the Indo-English poet exists in India and is a reality. Now, poetess, of course. Now we say poet to include both. And here I want to say one thing, that many of you all touched upon the subject, and this is what also today's topic is, that the Indo-English poet or writer or novelist is a complex, subtle person. Perhaps more so than others who come from a definite tradition. And I will take 5 minutes to tell my own story of perhaps complexity, which makes me wonder who I am. I happen to be a Sindhi, and that language, as many of you all know, Sindhis don't have their state. So we don't hear that language anywhere. So I grew up after partition when my parents came here. They sent us to Catholic schools. They sent us abroad for education. And we stayed there. We wrote poems in English. And of course, Eliot and William Blake and all that was there. We came back to India after our education, and then we looked around, and I think Shakespeare said this, that we tried to answer the question, who am I? Which is what all great literature does in the end, I think. Who am I? And I found that I did not know anything about my Sindhi background. I couldn't speak the language. And I was writing poetry in English, having readings, awards, and all that. The usual, life of a professional writer today, festivals like these. And then about a few years back, I decided to translate, and this is going back to heritage. I translated a 16th century Sufi poet called Shah Abdul Latif. And he was our greatest poet. And he was a great poet. I don't think you should only translate your own tradition, but I think anywhere where we get a chance to find a great poet. And as I was translating, I do not speak I cannot read the Sindhi language. So this is what I want to tell translators, is we have to collaborate. Because the Sahitya Academy does so many translations that are of poor quality only because we expect the same person to be an expert in English and Hindi and whatever the original language. And that creature does not exist, in my opinion. If he does, he's a genius, and geniuses are far, far in between. So let us collaborate if we are to preserve our past, which I strongly believe in, if we are to forge some way of, call it postmodernism or post. These people leave for the scholars to invent these words. But I think the collaboration is very important. To say that I'm a Bengali and I do not want to translate into English and then get translated into German. I want to translate only from Bengali straight to German. I don't think this matters. If English is a language of communication, it's like a computer, it's like a mobile phone. If you can use it, why have this thing about being egoistic about it? Let's use all the languages which this wonderful festival has given us, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting discussion and we can go on, and I'm actually amazed by the patience of the listeners at such a fag end of a festival when we are all tired with very intense deliberations. So we will actually respect time here, and Hemant has said that he reads time. So we also need to respect time. So are we allowed to have questions? Do we have time for some questions? I don't think so. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay, this question sort of picks up from where Anjali left. Now, I personally have observed that there are two ways of per se, absorbing and assimilating tradition, if you were to call it. One is an external allegiance. You sort of read something, you identify with it, and then you externally say that I'm going to adhere to this, I'm going to write to this. Second is this sort of internal absorption where when you're reading, you're just reading. When you're writing, you're just writing. So when you're reading, okay, you get this gut feeling or you get this vibe that this is a great work that I need to read. While I'm reading it, I'm not thinking that I'm going to use this in my work. I'm just reading it. And I keep reading, and while I'm writing as sort of a blank slate, and somewhere it's become a part of me and it comes out naturally. So I want to know from you that as a writer, how do these two different approaches affect the writer personally and his writing?
Yeah. Okay. Do they really affect you, or are you thinking too much about it?
No, they do, because I'm a writer myself, so.
Okay. Well, I think they are quite two different activities. You have answered your own question. When I'm reading about my past, I'm trying to learn something. Perhaps if I was a PhD student, I would have learned anyway in English literature, which obviously you're not, because you would have known that knowledge. When you're writing, you're just writing. So I think these are two separate activities. I mean, the use of the left brain and the right brain, we don't want to get into, but that, I think, takes in another part of the brain. When you're writing creatively, you cannot think about what you're writing, you just write. Later on, you might analyze that my poem looks like a bit like Nissomesicals, later on, but not that time. Please don't do that.
No,
You
I
spoil
don't
your
do
poetry.
that. That's why I'm stating that in the first place.
Yeah, okay.
Actually, Ramanujan had a very interesting take when he divides the world into Akkam and Puram, the inner world. He draws his poetics from Shangam literature, where he talks about the inner world and the outer world and the correlation between the two. The inner made by tradition, maybe. So I think it's left to the poets to resolve that question for themselves. That is the creative question, I think.
I just wanted to share my personal experience in writing. I also come from advertising, and I have been a mathematician before that. I'm a filmmaker now. And I completely agree when Hemanji says that it is time that I read, and with his experience that it is all about spontaneity and what I am today. And I never thought I could write because I was in advertising, and I'd never thought that after being a mathematician and I could ever, but I wrote poetry, and I just want to share one which actually talks about the process that happens with me. एक बार फिर ये कौन है जो ये सब कह गुजरता है, मेरे अंदर से कौन पुकारता है कभी, बेसब्री से मेरी ये उंगलियां तड़पने लगती हैं, चित एक कोना बिल्कुल एकांत सा, ढूंढने को तरसने लगता है, पैरों में धैर्य नहीं होता, सारी चेतना उसके साथ हो जाती है जब वो अजनबी दस्तक देता है. Just a few more lines.
So can you actually ask a specific question so that we can respond?
I'm just saying that poetry is a matter of spontaneity. I mean, because I haven't been a student of literature myself, and I have, and it finally grew into such a passion that I have written my screenplay, and I'm writing short stories. And so I think it is an extension, like any art form, whether it is painting or whether it is writing, it is finally an expression of what you are in today's time in this flux. And it is an expression.
Respond to that?
So it's not a question, it's more of a observation. Absolutely.
Of course, poetry is a question, is an art, and of course it is the first draft at least is spontaneous, at least in my case.
Absolutely.
But that doesn't take anything away from the hard work it actually takes to finish a piece. I've gone through like 25 rounds of edit on an 8-line poem, and that is probably, and editing is an extremely vital part of the process. And that is something when you are judging what you wrote with that sort of an outburst. It was this whole you might get a first draft out in 15 minutes, and that first draft is the mode that you're in, and mode is still a very superficial thing. But let's say whoever you are at that moment, that first draft probably is an expression of that self. But I don't think it's limited only to that. There is a lot of hard work that poetry demands, and I think if you are serious about it, you have to go through that, is what I believe in.
Actually, the idea that poetry is spontaneous is also a historical appearance.
Yes,
it comes forth in lyrical ballads. The idea that poetry is spontaneous. There have been various models of what is poetry and how the creativity happens. Means, if you go back to Sanskrit poetics, then they would ask you to read everything on the planet. And there is a Raj Shekhar who writes about Kavya Purush and how that person is to be trained. Means, that the idea that poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings is a romantic idea, right? And it's not the only idea. And I would agree with Mihir that revision is, I think, something that good poets do.
Well, I would like to say that it's so hard to say who's good, who's not good. At the same time, I mean, without being judgmental, like it's a process. I mean, how Da Vinci painted and how Rembrandt painted, it was completely different. But you can't say that being a mathematician or being
No, it has nothing to do with your being a student of literature, or it's just about art. Means if you are saying I'm studying dance, then you have to undergo training for dance.
The process can be different.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Yeah, I think it would be beneficial if we look at two very critical aspects of tradition: the implication of tradition and the association of tradition. You see, going by the etymological construction of the word tradition, it comes from Latin traditio, which means to hand over, which also means to surrender and yield. So this actually characterizes tradition as a process of continuity as well as a resource. But there is also another aspect which is implied in this, and that is the one of responsibility. Now, in my language, the Khasi language, we have, for tradition, we use the word nonkanti, which means wages earned by hands. Now, that implies responsibility. So, if you look, at this in this manner, I think we would get the greater, sort of the meaning of tradition. And also, which Shafi Sahab had mentioned, the orality, which is intrinsic actually to tradition. I mean, when you talk about oral tradition, we remember that the oral is as important as tradition. So, when he said that we should not try to be like Haldar Sahab, I fail to understand that point, because tradition actually starts from the oral. So we should not exclusively restrict our understanding of tradition to the written metaphors.
Yes.
Mr. Desmond, I'm not saying that we must altogether reject orality, tradition, everything, and create something out of nothing. That is not my point. My only emphasis is that tradition should not be recycled as we do in the ghazal form, as we do in the song form. Tradition has to be assimilated into the structure, the texture of the new. But the new arises from the newness of man, the creating self. And the creating self is not made once for all. I am not made once for all. I am 67-year-old person, but every moment I feel myself re-emerging, being recreated. Man is not made in one day. It is just a process of growing. So when it's a process of growing, his creativity should also grow according to his own. It should be commensurate with his growth. And it should at the same time commensurate with the growth of the overall society. Unfortunately, in Indian society, in spite of these paraphernalia, this, we are still feudal. We are still wallowing in the old, what we should have sloughed out. But we are not able to, unfortunately, because we have not undergone any industrial revolution. We are yet to see the Renaissance. We have jumped from medievalism to electronic medium. That is the problem. And that is the basic problem of many evils that Indian society or Pakistani society is facing. This sudden jump from that evolutionary process we have not seen.
Yes, I would agree with Shafi. What he's saying is that even oral traditions have to be critically looked at instead of glorifying and romanticizing orality. Because there are oppressive structures at work even in the oral, because oral is not just something coming from nothing, it comes from society. And if the society is structured in an uneven or unequal way, then that inequality will show up even in the orality. So it's orality as purity is something that I really question and doubt at this stage. It's there, orality, and it's different from written. But this romanticization is something which I would be very wary of, personally.
Hello. Yes, sir. This is an open question. Like any other form of art, there are two sides. One is the elite, another is the mass. The one who produces a form of art, or who writer, or one who reads it. Now, what does the writer? The history tells us that there are two types. One is popular, but definitely they are not great. So do you find the difference in modern times also? First thing. Second thing, I have always, this is my personal view, that art is always combined with traditions. The percentage may differ. Something called modern art still exists, but does it go and influence and play that part in the modern society?
Sanjeev, would you like to respond to the question of
to say
Yeah.
I'm tempted to say something. I know this is just an event, and it will go with the events. Whatever we say, we are not going to decide things. But unfortunately, for the last 26 years, 25 years, I have been seeing that even readers have undergone a tremendous change. I see the teenagers of today, the college students, university students, taking every rubbish, garbage from the roadside and go on reading. They are always reading in the railway, on the railway tracks, in the aeroplanes. But there was a time in my childhood, in my youth, when there was a competition of reading great classics. But whether I've half finished Proust, Remembrance of Things. I half finished Dostoevsky's Idiot. But still there was a competition, and we used to, there was a combative attitude among the readers, reading the masters. But all those masters have simply been forgotten. Among the youngsters, I have been a teacher for the last 35 years. I have yet to see a student of mine who is interested in the great novels of Russia, great novels of France or America. Not a single student is there who is interested in this sublime literature. Even their names are forgotten. This is very unfortunate. Even in India, for the last 20 years, many of our contemporaries died, some of my age also. But who knows their name? K. Ayappa Panikar, he used to be one among us here. Vijay Tendulkar, Dilip Chitre, so many I know and I have been conversing with. I have worked with Ayappa Panikar, Medieval Indian Literature, voluminous work, and the Encyclopedia of Indian Literature, Modern Indian Anthology of Modern Literature, etc., etc. And how we used to discuss everything and compare it with the great classics. But when we attempt to write a novel, at least we must have read, at least not, if not Tolstoy, if not Dostoevsky, at least Hardy, at least some English novelist. Only then, unless we are conversant with the style, the technique of writing a novel, we should not attempt it.
Thanks. Sanjeev wants to come in on this point, and I think with this we will end the panel and we'll go over to the poetry reading.
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit, just small this thing. Trying to sum up a couple of things which you said. And the problem, I think, again, I'm going back to, in fact, I wanted to refer Salil's comment also, how the space of the literature is going to be hijacked or robbed of by other morchas and things. But I just going back and in this turbo capitalism, whatever we call, of today's thing, as you said, why people are being forgotten. We are living in a very interesting period and very disturbing period also. This period is like it has got only a perpetual present, and that's the main problem. In the perpetual present, what happens is all of us are continuously in a present tense only. There is no past and therefore no future. So that's the basic thing. And the other thing, I'm just trying to cursorily just touch some of the points. The breaking news culture. So by the time if you try to remember last 10 breaking news, we will not be able to remember a single one. And all were breaking news. So that is the problem. That's the problem we are living with. So forgetting Chitre, forgetting Kolatkar it's become like a distant, kahan gaye malum bhi nahi. Because we don't even the minute before breaking news what it was. And that's the major problem everybody is talking about. It is being talked from Microsoft to philosophers like Jameson to Zizek to everyone. Who name, and everyone is talking about what to do with this perpetual present thing. And therefore, what I feel is traditions become very important. Here the poet, writer, artist, he becomes a medium. Medium to do what? Medium to reclaim lost space. What is that lost space? Lost space is a public space. And what is that public space? The last public space which we are losing today is the language. Or other public spaces we already lost. The last public space, as earlier I talked to about how colonization happens, the last public space is a language. And that is to be saved or reclaimed. Right to city, right for public space, right for language. That's how it is. It's a political thing, of course, and it has to be. So this is one point. And here traditions, how literature or art need to be reorganized with tradition comes back. Because here is the opportunity it gives to readjust the old to accommodate the new so that the past can be seen in a new lens, in a proper way. That's how it is. Thank you.
So I think on this inauspicious note, we stop here. And I personally would like to thank the organizers of LIC Gateway for giving us opportunity to share our views